why does offshore wind have to be part of the solution? And I never want to pit other renewables against each other, right? There's a multi-technology companies that are represented on here. But why can't we do this, without offshore wind? Why can't we reach our decarbonization goals without moving into the ocean with renewables? So I'll just open it up and see what you guys think. I'll ask another follow-up question to that, but just want to make sure that we understand the real need for this as you all see it.
Yeah, I can kick us off to speak to that briefly and then turn it over to others. We are going to need, as we look to our climate goals, both with respect to decarbonizing the electric system by 2035 and decarbonizing the economy as a whole by 2050, we are going to need a large and diverse amount of clean energy solutions. And it's hard to understate the scale of resources that we're going to need. And as we look to coastal regions, offshore wind is a really powerful tool in regions that have dense population centers, that can have siting constraints with respect to large-scale land-based renewables, and that can have siting constraints with respect to large-scale transmission. And so as we're looking to how do we decarbonize those coastal regions, and then how do we decarbonize the economy as a whole, as we look to clean fuel generation, offshore wind is really going to be a critical part of our energy mix in the future.
Jocelyn's laid out what the sort of federal view on it is. What's happening in the states as they see the need for this?
Yeah, that's great. Maybe I can talk a little bit about the East Coast and then we can tag team West Coast. One thing I wanted to underscore though before I get to that point is that, and I think Jocelyn kind of laying out the opportunity, that's all completely on target. One thing that sometimes does get lost is that while obviously the generation will be off of the coasts, offshore wind is not just a coastal solution. I mean, for our projects alone, we've been able to trace the supply chain to 45 different states in the US and stretching into the heartland. Certainly the Gulf Coast is a critically important piece of our supply chain story, which I can talk about more later. So I don't want to leave the impression that this is only a coastal conversation. Of course, from a, kind of policy conversation, that's often where it's driven, and that gets into the conversation about the markets. But the opportunity, the job creation, the economic development, that really stretches broadly throughout the U.S., which is terrific to helping us build longevity and durability for the industry. The states have really served as the early drivers for the growth of offshore wind in the U.S. We are developing projects primarily in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, and we've seen governors and state legislators step forward with very ambitious goals for procurement of offshore wind, and then follow up those goals with setting, reliable schedules and advancing procurement opportunities that developers like us are able to compete for. And that's been critical to creating the kind of long-term visibility that we as developers need, confidence in those pipelines, confidence that there'll be opportunities to sell into these markets for clean energy. I'd cite state governments like Massachusetts, certainly Rhode Island has gotten a lot of love already today. New York, New Jersey, Governor Moore right around the corner in Maryland has just stepped out with a really aggressive 8.5 gigawatt goal for tiny little Maryland. And so the ambition is there, and we've seen states really continue to step up and set the structures and the procurement mechanisms in place to enable that. And I think we'll see that continue to grow as we move forward. And the partnership between the states and the federal government, you guys can probably speak to this better than I can, but we think that's where this all really just kind of hits the, really everything hits its stride when you've got the federal government able to partner with the state government and of course then with the developer and private sector community in building this out. And I think we're kind of at that moment, and it's fun to be part of.
Yeah. Before we get to California, John, you had a
I just
comment. Yeah.
wanted to comment, Kathleen, what's really interesting is New York State, just to show a little bit of love for the great state of New York, they've taken this policy conversation to the next level. As a New Yorker, try to get a natural gas hookup right now. You cannot,
Yeah.
right? Why? Because there has been a decision that electrification is the way to go. And I think one of those incredible examples of that is going to be the new JP Morgan Chase building, which will be fully electric. So that is the future. I mean, policy is now driving why we need this. We need ocean wind.
That's right. And I mean, New York has been a standout leader in this regard. We love all our children equally, of course. But, you know, and so much of this really is, of course, aggressive climate goals, specific offshore wind goals, electrification goals, but also the jobs and supply chain aspect of this industry, and the opportunity there has been such a focal point for Governor Hochul. You know, her commitment to creating a supply chain based in New York, giving opportunity to New Yorkers, is advancing this conversation so swiftly as well. So it's great to be able to see kind of all of the pieces coming together there.
Before we go to California, Dr. Spinner?
Well, let's go to California first.
There we go, California.
Well, I think to build on what was already been said, I think certainly applies for California as well. And I will maybe add as well that one of the key features of offshore wind is not only its quantity and abundance as a resource, but its quality when it is generating when it's needed most. That's true on the East Coast in the cold winter months when natural gas-fired generation is constrained and can drive up price spikes. That also happens to be when offshore wind is generating the most and has the most value. That's equally the case in California, where solar energy is waning at the end of the day when the sun is going down, just when offshore wind energy is peaking. So it is a complementary resource that is going to play a critical role as a part of that broad suite of renewable resources. So California has a goal of being carbon neutral and carbon-free electricity by 2045. Offshore wind is going to play a really critical role in doing that, and we see similarly state leadership driving that. The state committed to a planning goal of 25 gigawatts by 2045. That is a huge lift, but it's something that is, we're starting to see a lot of leadership from the state to help to realize that through AB 525, a piece of legislation that was passed that is setting the state on a trajectory towards preparing and planning for offshore wind. And it's needed because, as was already mentioned, electrification, the state has massive electric vehicle goals. So in addition to the retirements of fossil generation and the soon-to-be hopeful retirement of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, the overall load will be increasing. So that's the perspective on California.
Thank you. Dr. Spinrad.
Yeah, I want to put a little bit of an asterisk on this conversation. It comes back to the way you framed the question, Stephanie, and point out that, yes, we are here to talk about offshore wind. Yes, we are here to talk about the ocean's role in climate. And most of what we're talking about is in the mitigation agenda. It's in renewables, it's in decarbonizing. There is also a very important role the ocean plays on the adaptation side as well. And as evidenced by the administration's publication of an Ocean Climate Action Plan, in which we talk about renewables, but we also talk about things like marine carbon dioxide reduction. And so those are not separable arguments. And in fact, one of the fascinating aspects of this discussion, I think, with the developers is how might we use the build out of offshore wind and wind farms as a means, for example, for positioning monitoring capabilities that could help contribute to a marine carbon dioxide reduction agenda as well. So let's think about this holistically.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really very important point. I'll just say when Turn Forward, we launched at the end of 2022, we did so with polling about American support for offshore wind in coastal communities, and offshore wind was wildly positively supported by coastal residents. The number one concern that they have though about offshore wind, marine mammal protection and bats and birds and bats. And so, I think this is a good place to start when we talk about that challenge. How do we do this right? And Dr. Spinrad, I'll just ask you from your perspective as the NOAA administrator, how does NOAA view this challenge and what do we need to do to get right? You referred to the North Atlantic Right Whale rules and strategies, but what is it that we need to get right as a community?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I would say that, again, as a science-based organization, one of the most important things we need to do is get the right science upon which to frame the questions. make sure we understand what are the priority questions. So I mentioned the issue of addressing our responsibilities for management of fisheries, which requires us capability to do stock assessments. If we start looking at changing how we do stock assessments, there's a question of scientific credibility. So you do it one way for 100 years and then you change the way you do it because we are considering placement of wind farms or other considerations. We have to have a scientifically viable way of saying, this is the stock assessment today as comparable to the stock assessment we did last year. The other part of it also is making sure that our statutory responsibilities associated with things like endangered species and marine mammal protection are framed in ways that allow us to get the best answers to questions like exactly how many North Atlantic right whales are there? Where are they now? Where are they going to be? And can we get that information into the hands of decision makers to make important decisions, not just about placement or siting, but also about operational approaches? And so it's all going to end up being scientifically based. For us at NOAA, I think a lot of the challenges are about basically resourcing up to answer the questions. The developers have a time frame, a time scale that is the speed of business, if you will. We have a time frame that is the speed of government. How do we get these married up together? So I'll give you just one example. One of our busiest offices is our office up in Gloucester, GARFO as we call it, Greater Atlantic Region Fisheries Office, where if you went up to GARFO about 5 or 10 years ago, you would have seen 1 or 2 people responsible for dealing with permitting issues. Now we're having to scale up to almost 60. And so just getting those people in place to deal with the volume of decisions and permitting decisions and coordinating with our colleagues in BOEM and Department of Energy means we've got to work aggressively while we're doing the business of managing fisheries day to day anyway. And so consequently, staffing, resources, coordination and collaboration, understanding the business operations and the business plans of the developers is part of that as well. So it is, to some extent, somebody characterized it a little bit like building the airplane while you're flying it. And there is a little bit of that. Rest assured, we're doing it safely. And I would just close out by saying the last part of it is dealing with what, quite honestly, many times are volumes of misinformation, dare I say, disinformation. And so working with the people in the know, with the developers, with the communities that I alluded to in my comments, to make sure the best scientific information is out there for people to understand. So the public who says, yeah, we like that, but we understand there may be concerns associated with impact on whales, we can turn around and say, in fact, the best science suggests that's not the case. Here's what we need to do to get that information to you and make sure you're better advised with respect to these kinds of concerns.
Absolutely. Thank you. John, anything to add to that?
We talk a great deal about the manufacturing opportunities and the construction opportunities. You talk about permitting. There's also the ecological and biological monitoring opportunities. And there hasn't been as much in that area. And for us, you know, I'm a child of immigrants, and we want to make sure that those opportunities are there. And there's going to have to be work done over the next 2 to 4 to 6 years to make sure we have that pipeline or that lattice available. So I just want to make sure as we're thinking about these issues, we don't forget that.
Yeah. And John, Kathleen and Tyler, I mean, from where you sit, you know, these critical issues of making sure that, and you both have mentioned it, but just, is there anything that you want this audience to know about what you're doing as it relates to this marine mammal protection and making sure that we do this right as we build this out?
Sure. Yeah, it's a incredible area of focus and prioritization for us. So we appreciate the opportunity. We also appreciate the challenge that, you know, NOAA and all the federal agencies are having and adapting to working with developers as we're advancing all these projects. And, you know, please continue the dialogue. You know, we know our teams are in touch on a daily, if not more frequent basis. And we're certainly continue to support increased resources flowing to the agencies to help with this, because we recognize as more and more projects are being developed and advancing, you know, there's going to be more commitment, not more commitment, but just more time and effort that's required on the part of the agencies. So thank you for that, and we'll continue to do our part there. I think one thing that's important to know about offshore wind projects is that there are a number of protections that are in place for our industry that are stricter than exist for a number of other maritime users. So this is an area that we spend a lot of time, focus, attention, and there's arguably more kind of rigor and requirement in place for offshore wind than there is for many other industries. Just some notes: speed restrictions, use of protective species observers on our vessels, limitations certainly on when survey and construction activities can take place based on marine mammal habitat needs. And that's something we obviously take very, very seriously in collaboration with all of our federal and state permitting partners.
If I can add one other comment too, since we're talking about climate change as the driving force behind a lot of this, we also need to consider the uncertainty with respect to things like distributions of those species. As we see climate change, there are some very important scientific questions right now about what may be driving the populations of whales off the east coast of the United States. And so part of this is making sure we're doing the research that, if you will, looks forward, kind of passes the puck to where it will be in terms of trying to understand what are the consequences of climate change as they may manifest 5 or 10 years from now, in terms of our ability to monitor the ecosystem and especially the marine mammals.
Yeah.
And just to pick up on that, I mean, I think collaboration is the perfect word. And I think we have to be thinking about this, between all of us. And from an acoustic monitoring perspective, WCS has been working very closely with the industry on that. And also, more importantly, there's a feedback loop. That information is also available at the aquarium, so that the communities themselves can learn more about what is happening. So that's an important feedback loop as well. I do appreciate the words Dr. Spenrad regarding looking at kind of, as I said before, this whole of ecosystem approach. I mean, I think obviously we care about North Atlantic right whale, it's important, but we need to be thinking about all the species that are impacted by the work that's being done there.
Tyler, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I think that I'll say that it's our responsibility and commitment to do good science. And also that the offshore wind industry will increase the understanding of the marine environment. We'll generate a lot of data. We've seen that already through projects. We've seen that through public investment in data collection. And also there's structures that support collaborative and jointly scoped research that are critical. We're seeing that on the East Coast, and there's efforts to stage that up on the West Coast. So together, those things are going to be really critical tools to help make sure that we're ensuring conservation of marine mammals and other species in the marine environment overall.
I will tell you that, and it's the asterisk, it can be transformative, or it cannot. I mean, it's a choice that we will make, and many of the people on this panel will have that ability. As an organization that is headquartered in New York and that is a major conservation organization where DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, is kind of at the core of who we are and the values that we're trying to promote, we're kind of advocating, as one of the reasons why I wanted to be on this panel, to make sure that we don't lose sight of that opportunity. From a New York kind of institutional perspective, from a municipal perspective, we need this energy to continue. I mean, we've closed our nuclear power plant in New York. We need it. Now, having said that, the economy in New York has gone through, it goes through peaks and valleys. This, I think, will be one of those opportunities, especially in places like South Brooklyn, depending on where these opportunities come out. But there are still pockets of poverty, and this can be truly transformative. But again, with that asterisk next to it.
Yeah, I think that's right, John. I mean, it really does take commitment and focus to the communities where we're building these projects. There is incredible potential. We are really excited. I'll talk a little bit about a program we just launched in Atlantic City, New Jersey, a few weeks ago, which we call wind power ready. Our first iteration of it is in Atlantic City, but our ambition is to expand this to other locations.
I know a few
where
places
we're building
that
our
we could-
projects. You've got some ideas for me? Good, we'll talk after. But this is particularly focused on turbine techs, which is a career track that doesn't require an incredible amount of education or past training, and is one that's very high paying, but accessible to people without that sort of established background. And we want to hire turbine techs from the communities where we're building these projects. So these are real. They're here today. And the focus and the attention needs to be put looking forward to make sure that we're doing exactly what you're talking about, John, and bringing the communities in, making sure that this is an industry that, since it's new and we have the chance to do this right, that we really are doing it. And we're excited about participating in that.
The one thing that I want to just say about South Fork Wind Farm, it's 130 megawatts of offshore wind project, and that kind of number of jobs. So sometimes people will hear, oh, 300 jobs, 400 jobs. That's 0.1 gigawatt.
Yeah.
We're talking about 50 gigawatts.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just want to put it in the place.
Yep.
It's a big project, and it's going to be so much bigger. So, I'm sorry, John. Dr. Spinrad, yeah.
Yeah, I want to talk, your question was about economic development.
Yeah.
And we're talking in the near horizon, I would say, in the, say, 5-year, 7-year time period. There's an economic opportunity well beyond that, and it's associated with what we're calling the new blue economy at NOAA. And another way to think of this is the climate industrial complex. It's a service-based industry. And that is to say that our ability to collect information about the ocean and use that information to inform decisions is going to depend on industries, robust industries' need for that information. So right now, think of how the insurance and the reinsurance industry uses that kind of environmental intelligence. The build out of the offshore wind industry will create a market for that new blue economy, that information-based economy. And by some estimates, the climate-based services economy is expected to be anywhere between a $100 billion and a $1 trillion economy. Compare that to the $10 billion commercial weather enterprise. So this is a real tsunami of economic development that we're going to see supporting a range of markets, including offshore wind.
And I just want to share, I mean, as we're thinking about this, let's ensure the engagement of Native American communities, like the Shinnecock Nation, as we're thinking about, obviously, from our perspective, as we're thinking more about Hudson Canyon, et cetera, we want to make sure that all communities are engaged. And I kind of smile and I think about economic opportunity and political will and diversity in all of its forms. One of the great things that we've found is that we've actually been able to bring Democrats and Republicans together, so that this is not being seen as a Democrat or Republican, conservative or progressive approach. This is really all elements of the political body. And I think let's not forget that as well. And I think that is a really incredible opportunity we have to move this process forward.
And I'm very glad that you said that, because I do think that one of the things we really have to just make sure as we move forward, past this next couple of years, is how do we make this a must-have, not a nice-to-have? That it's not one any particular administration or governor or political party's agenda, but that this is actually a part of what it means to build out this new energy landscape.
John's absolutely, gigawatts are not red or blue, they are purple.
Exactly. Okay, so I'm going to, in the interest of time, go to the couple of questions that dealt with a few of the other challenges that we have here. And I'm going to first take a look at transmission. I'm actually going to, this is both a state and federal issue, but I'm going to start with you, Jocelyn. What is happening as it relates to transmission? This is obviously a really new thing that we're trying to do here. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we build out offshore wind, there's going to be a range of transmission challenges that we're going to need to resolve as we're thinking about the first generation of projects. We're thinking about ensuring they have points of interconnection, that we're doing the land-based upgrades to the transmission system that's needed to connect them to the grid. As we look to scale up offshore wind, we need to be planning for shared transmission in the future, and we need to be doing that with a marine spatial planning lens. So thinking about how we build transmission in a way that considers both the environment and ocean co-users. And there is quite a bit of work being done right now to help plan the transmission systems of the future for offshore wind. Just at the Department of Energy alone, we're doing work in partnership with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to both analyze what future offshore wind transmission topologies might look like, to convene stakeholders around those options. We're going to publish soon in partnership with BOEM an action plan for how we might develop transmission on the Atlantic, and we're also turning our eyes to the West Coast. We're kicking off similar efforts there as we think to enabling floating offshore wind and large amounts of grid penetration there. And certainly the work of the federal government is not the only work that's being done there. States are actively planning for transmission solutions in the future. And then one other area of focus is also the R&D that's needed around transmission in the future. So at the Department of Energy, we're supporting work around HVDC, high voltage direct current technologies that can minimize electricity loss over long distances. We're doing work there. And then as we look to the future and we look to floating technologies, we're going to have some unique transmission needs there with respect to floating substations and dynamic array cables. And so quite a bit of work to be done in the transmission space, but also quite a bit of work underway. And I just might close by adding that through the bipartisan infrastructure law, there are also some additional resources to help support the development of new transmission, support the resilience of the grid, including DOE has $13 billion in funding on the street now to support activities like that.
No. Anything in markets, especially on the East Coast, Kathleen, that you might want to add?
Yeah, just one thing I'd note that I think particularly maybe the funding that you just mentioned always does facilitate collaboration. It's been exciting to see kind of states in New England particularly interested in how kind of federal funding might be able to help them think more long-term about what their transmission needs are and how that can be facilitated. So we're really encouraged to see that sort of collaboration again between the states and the federal government. It's so important to us. I feel like transmission is one of these issues that we talk about a lot. It feels like it shouldn't be, so hard. There's some technology issues, but a lot of it is about like planning and questions about who pays, which are fundamentally policy questions. And so kind of getting all the different actors to be focused on, kind of the challenges and working to resolve them is critically important.
I'm just going to borrow from, I think you said, we love all of our children equally when you were talking about projects. A question, what do you see as the greatest barrier to offshore wind development? We love all of our barriers equally. I'm not sure that there's a greatest one. So I'll just throw that out if there's an answer that you guys would have to that as the panelists, but just specifically around supply chain and port infrastructure. The current port infrastructure is insufficient to meet the 30 gigawatts by 2030 goal, let alone create tens of thousands of American jobs. How can we close the funding and supply chain gaps to really build this out? And so the private sector has a role in that, the public sector has a role in that. And so I'll open it up to whoever would like to start.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, the question is fundamentally correct. We exist within a global supply chain right now. There's high demand for offshore wind components driven in large part by European markets. So, we're not immune to those pressures. That is further to the point of the need to invest in building a domestic supply chain to catch up with that demand, and ports are fundamental to that. They are key pieces of infrastructure that are purpose-built for offshore wind. They require large spaces for laying down components, heavy loading capacity for lifting those components, in the case of floating offshore wind, doing those construction activities in port. Importantly, also, they are the focal points for jobs and economic development. That is critical. It's not surprisingly, it takes a long time to develop those specialized ports, and we need to really begin to do that now. And we need to do it in a way that's not necessarily going to be always done, through competitive solicitations for power purchase contracts. Has been done on the East Coast, and essentially having those costs be borne by ratepayers. I think that there is the need for creative state solutions, creative federal solutions to enable that infrastructure development now so that it can be ready when these projects are ready to be delivered, and that we can begin to foresee the job opportunities and supply chain opportunities so that when those projects are built, they're being built with domestic workforce, they're being built with a domestic supply chain.
One thing that I would add there is, I think critical to developing the supply chain is going to be certainty with respect to the pipeline of offshore wind projects and the future of offshore wind development in the United States. And through both additional resources from bill and IRA, like additional funding to the Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration port program, which supports port development, but also through some of the tax credits, the extension of the production tax credit and investment tax credit, but also new manufacturing tax credits. I think we have some important tools with respect to both incentivizing manufacturing, but also helping shore up some of the certainty in terms of long-term policy certainty in terms of development.
Great. What are your takeaways for this audience? What do you want them to walk away knowing about this build out? And also, what advice would you give to them in terms of how they can help? No.
I hate to do it, but I'm going to throw it all on you. It's in your hands, right? You're here, and the people that are watching this, this idea of advocacy, right? Of engaging with your local elected officials, with your government officials. We talked a little bit about, I mentioned very quickly the vessel speed rule. That's an issue, if we do care about marine life, that we're going to have to be engaged in. There's been a lot of movement on that on Capitol Hill literally in the last 24 hours. But that, conceptually, it's about advocacy. We can create the future that we want, right? If we talk about diversity and equity inclusion but do nothing, then nothing will happen, right? So at this point, we're trying to lead by example at WCS, and we need other institutions and organizations across the country to do the same thing. And in a good way, put pressure on our government officials to make sure that and our colleagues and our business partners, right? Because I don't see these, we're not adversaries, we are collaborators. And I think they're going to be looking to us to say, okay, what do we need to do to make sure that these projects are effective and have the local support? And that's going to come back to us and to all of you.
I will build on that to say that offshore wind can be built and operated in a way that helps to realize the goals of marine conservation. We have a lot of work ahead of us in permitting projects. We'll be doing good science. Ask folks to really see the value proposition that offshore wind provides to help realize the goals of marine conservation, and that we are doing that work, and that we're working towards common goals.
Yeah, and I really see us here at this moment at an inflection point where we're going from planning for offshore wind into the reality of offshore wind. And I think that comes with both the economic opportunity that we've been talking about, but also a learning opportunity with respect to really understanding from this first generation of projects, what are the impacts, how do we work to both in an adaptive fashion ensure that we learn from those projects as we work to develop the next generation of projects. And you know, it is going to take, I think we touched on some of the challenges and some of the work that lays before us, and we have an enormous amount of work to do to move forward here, both with respect to offshore wind, but with respect to the broader climate question. And it really is going to take the work of all of us assembled to get here. And it's for me, you know, walking here through the smoke, it's hard to not feel like that is our collective call to action. This is an incredibly important thing that we're all working on. How do we transition our energy system, but how do we do that in a way that's just and sustainable?
And this is the year that this all becomes real in this country, right? This year, 2023, is when you're going to have commercial scale projects installed and producing power. So it's an incredibly exciting moment. And I really do feel, though, that not a lot, it's amazing to see this room and know that there's a large group online participating in this conversation. It really is going to take the kind of collective work of us and so many partners to kind of share the story, to share the opportunity, the promise of doing this right, and to bring that home with you. I mean, I spoke about how, you know, a lot of people think this is a, you know, Northeast thing. 45 states are, contributing to our supply chain for our company alone. And so this, just sharing the story, getting political leaders at all levels engaged and enthused and involved is a critical piece of the puzzle, and a way that everyone in this room can help. And we're happy to be partners in that however we can.
Yeah, and I'd add, get the word out and get the feedback in. And I think speaking as one government representative here, there's a lot of good stuff out there available for the public to understand, from policy, from science, from monitoring information. Help get that word out to people who may have questions or concerns. But also, we need your feedback. We need to understand what the concerns are.
Yeah.
People do that pretty well. We get thousands of comments in public comment period, but we welcome that. We'll send it all into ChatGPT and get it all sorted.
And I will just add to that, to be critical consumers of information and push back on disinformation, especially at these particular moments. So again, we are 2 minutes over time here, so thank you for your indulgence of us, Shannon. Thank you very much for your attention. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank you not for your participation today, but for all the hard work that you are doing. It's going to take all of us, and I look forward to the continued journey with you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Definitely.